Hi, everyone. My name is Andy Kim. I'm a postdoctoral research fellow at the Massachusetts General Hospital. I'm a researcher at the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, South Africa. Thank you so much for attending my talk. And the title of my presentation is Understanding the Biological and Psychiatric Legacies of Intergenerational Trauma from South African Apartheid Towards an Anti-Racist Science. My parents immigrated to the United States from South Korea in the late 80s in search of political stability and economic opportunity. While they did not come with much money or many belongings, as children of survivors of Japanese colonialism and the Korean War, my parents brought with them the heavy burdens of historical trauma from militarized occupation and their memories of growing up in a precarious and rapidly transitioning post-war society. As I grew older and became aware of such violent histories, I wondered how the phantoms of my family's past could continue to haunt us in the future. How did my ancestors, grandparents, and parents endure and overcome such oppressive conditions? And could the cumulative trauma they embodied over time reverberate across multiple generations and affect me? In the past 2 decades, scientists have taken growing interest in the possibility that human physiological mechanisms may underlie the transmission of stress and trauma across generations. Major recent scientific breakthroughs, such as the epigenetic inheritance of maternal care in rats and the consonance of biological and psychiatric trauma phenotypes between Holocaust survivors and their unexposed children, shed light on the possibility that the effects of trauma may be intergenerationally transmissible through hormonal and epigenetic processes. Though scientists have only recently documented the intergenerational impacts of trauma on human biology and health, communities across the globe have long witnessed the lingering impacts of historical traumas on the health and well-being of subsequent generations. A large body of scholarship in public health and the social sciences has framed these cases of intergenerational trauma through deficit models of health and the theoretical lens of social suffering. Some communities have reclaimed scientific evidence of intergenerational trauma in order to raise awareness about the legacies of embodied oppression. For example, Native American, Australian Aboriginal, and African diasporic groups have used scientific studies of intergenerational stress transmission to push for reparative action and redistributive justice in their respective communities. Now, given the rapid pace at which scientific knowledge about the biology of intergenerational trauma is moving, as well as the deep political and ethical implications of such biosocial research, we must take pause to critically reflect on how scientific knowledge about intergenerational trauma is produced and its potential social implications. Addressing issues of historical trauma, reparations, and collective healing are essential to allowing historically marginalized communities create healthy and thriving societies in their own terms. This presentation is based on over 24 months of ethnographic research in Johannesburg, South Africa, and the neighboring city of Soweto, the location of a historically crucial township in the struggle against the apartheid regime, and also the site of a 2-year epidemiological study on the intergenerational mental health effects of trauma from apartheid, as well as the underlying biological mechanisms that facilitated this potential intergenerational pathway of stress transmission. I served as a principal investigator of a human biological study that drew from a larger longitudinal study of over years called Birth to 20, or colloquially known as Mandela's Children. And this study spans over 3 generations. Birth to 20 first recruited over 3,000 pregnant women all across Johannesburg, but primarily in Soweto, during the height of the dissolution of the apartheid government. In this paper, I first described the various stakes involved in the scientific study of intergenerational trauma. Second, I highlight a few tensions that have come from conducting this research in Soweto. And finally, I discuss the possible ethnographic and epidemiological opportunities to reject these dynamics in research and work towards a more politically engaged study of intergenerational trauma. The purpose of this study was to examine the intergenerational effects of political violence due to the dissolution of South African apartheid. I examined the extent to which trauma and societal adversity experienced among pregnant women shaped the mental health outcomes of their children born in 1990, who are now 30 to 31 years old, and their grandchildren between the ages of 4 and 10 using the Birth to 20 cohort. Additionally, I aim to understand the biological mechanisms that facilitated the relationship between prenatal stress during apartheid and the intergenerational mental health outcomes. I examined the role of neuroendocrinology by measuring salivary cortisol in both the second and the third generation, the second generation parents and the third generation children, and the human immune system in the second generation of adults. We also measured psychiatric risk both in the second generation and the third generation. Now, this study could have easily been one that explored the relationships between stress and health, as well as the biology of depression. But I began this work by striving to refuse the reductionist and colonial dynamics of conventional scientific and public health research. What drew me to this work initially, in addition to my personal experience, possibly with intergenerational trauma, was an interest in the legacies of racial violence, the politics imbued in the biological investigation of historical trauma, and the biology underlying the intergenerational effects of trauma through the lens of the developmental origins of health and disease. I knew that this study would enter a complex set of local and global politics, social, economic, political, biological, and an equally complex collection of stakes. The first stake involves debates of transitional justice in South Africa, which undoubtedly are complex and ongoing. The failures of the TRC, or the Truth and Reconciliation Council, to recognize the major portion of crimes and systemic acts of violence caused by the apartheid system and systemic racism as an organizing tool of apartheid have left the majority of non-white South Africans living in a state of false hopes and unresolved trauma. The superficial reconciliation of the TRC has been followed by overt processes of neoliberalism and capitalism, compounded by various cases of egregious forms of racial violence, including chronic conditions of anti-Black violence. But despite the recency of apartheid, the relevance of transitional justice in possibly the most unequal country in the world is not fully shared. Even today, it is not uncommon for adults of all backgrounds to claim that the ills of apartheid are no longer relevant today, and in some instances, to hear of cases of apartheid denialism. Within this controversial landscape of differing opinions, where perceived success of the project of transitional justice and questions of reckoning with the past remain contentious, how would, quote, objective evidence on the intergenerational biological effects of trauma from apartheid change this conversation? And if there are detected effects, how would this knowledge contribute to ongoing efforts for redistributive justice, such as the question of land restitution, if at all? The second concern centers around the politics of race and science. Here I think about the politics of scientific reductionism and plasticity. In a country where scientific research, including biological anthropology, concretized the formation and use of racial typologies in the formation of the apartheid blueprint less than a century ago, the risk of reifying the same reductionist thinking is high. STS scholar Maurizio Maloney describes the typological interpretation of causes and impacts of environmental exposures, which often map onto socially defined concepts of race and ethnicity and may reify racial deterministic explanations of health disparities. I also worry about the circulation of incorrect thoughts on trauma sequelae and its biological impacts as fixed effects, or in other words, quote, my biology is my destiny, or a related and equally flawed belief that one's environment from which trauma or adversity arises will have unequivocal effects on one's biology and health, thus running the risk of pathologizing resource-constrained communities. A third concern surrounding the depoliticization of the stress and trauma faced by pregnant women in our society, as well as the need for psychological healing due to biomedical logics, which often strips data from its social and political context. Rather than historicizing and politicizing the results and interpretations of our study on the intergenerational effects of trauma from apartheid, mainstream scientific and medical research may reduce our findings to mere statistical associations of stress and health. And finally, public mental health remains a major societal problem of epidemic proportions. Recent estimates show that the prevalence, incidence, and burden of mental illness in South Africa are relatively high compared to other countries. 1 in 3 South Africans are expected to develop a mental illness, a quarter of cases are considered severe, and nearly half of citizens are at risk of developing a psychiatric disorder in their lifetime. But despite these conditions, mental health care usage and access in South Africa is severely limited, as reflected by the 92% treatment cap for mental illnesses, meaning that only 8% of individuals with mental illnesses that need treatment actually receive treatment. Everyday violence and trauma have also long been normalized across most of the country. Now, I list only a small handful of considerations that come from a reflection on the possible stakes involved in the scientific study of intergenerational trauma in South Africa. And imbued in this research are critical and unresolved questions around recognition, reparations, and racism that are relevant in today's South Africa, as well as key points of tension that arise from the co-consideration of the social, biological, and the political. Next, I briefly describe some of these tensions through my observations and ethnographic work on my research study. The first tension I'd like to note is on the vicarious stress experienced by my research assistants, and in rare occurrences, acts of gender-based violence. My RAs would note that the difficulty of hearing about the social and economic struggles and traumatic experiences of their research participants, all of whom were also Black African identifying adults. These instances of vicarious stress and trauma, or the experience of stress and trauma that can result from being repeatedly exposed to other people's stress and trauma, exacerbated as we continued data collection telephonically during the COVID-19 pandemic. Quote, "Not much has changed," one of my RAs told me during a debrief session. Quote, "It's painful to see other Black people suffer," another told me. The mental health needs of research staff and participants are often under-recognized or unrecognized, and researchers face an ethical imperative to promote and safeguard the mental health of the societies with which we work. At the beginning of our study, we developed detailed distress protocols to triage patients and research staff based on their level of psychological distress. I also led frequent debriefing sessions and hired a clinical psychologist to allow my RAs to have deeper opportunities to process. We also developed a surveillance and referral system during COVID-19 for our research participants to identify immediate mental health and other household needs, such as food insecurity, medical attention, etc., and also to connect participants and their families with appropriate psychological resources and our limited mental health service ecology. With growing interest in the study of intergenerational life course effects of trauma, we must also be mindful of the potential to perpetuate new forms of violence to those we work alongside. And these reflections have recently been published in the commentary in the American Journal of Human Biology. The second point of tension comes from contrasting the profound social meaning and impacts that evidence for intergenerational trauma offers, and the relatively weak associations we actually see between past trauma and health outcomes of the next generation. Cortisol and inflammation are common targets used to detect the possible long-term effects of prenatal stress and underlying pathways. But we also know that many biological, social, and developmental factors are known to shape these biological markers of stress, making them difficult systems to reliably assess. And not all human studies use well-controlled study designs to study the long-term biological effects of intergenerational trauma. But as I note, the social meaning of this research in this public sphere is well known. For example, the infiltration of quote epigenetic talk in public discourse around historical trauma, issues surrounding the inheritance of environmental exposures and how studies of intergenerational trauma inform classic nature-nurture debates, or the use of this knowledge for political advocacy. For instance, civilian survivors of the Bugoro massacre in the Democratic Republic of Congo cited scientific evidence on the intergenerational effects of trauma, altering mother-child attachment behaviors and child cortisol levels in a case of reparations in front of the International Criminal Court. Unfortunately, their appeal for reparations were rejected based on the opinion that evidence provided about the massacre was not convincing enough to prove intergenerational harm and warrant reparations. The court also concluded that evidence that occurred before the Bugoro attacks could have contributed to harm. And finally, the concern that sits at the center of my quandary is how biological knowledge can be used to make political claims. In the context of studies on intergenerational trauma, what would these results prove? If there are positive effects from the perspective of the developmental origins of health and disease, we should show that we would show that the long-term legacies of apartheid still linger across the life course and intergenerationally. And as we've seen already, these quantitative data can support political movements for redress and retribution. But if we don't see effects, then we could conclude past trauma may not actually matter, which, depending on one's priorities, could also be positive. For example, null findings can suggest that historically traumatized communities are not continually affected by past trauma. But negative findings may be a specter of the larger perception that, in the case of South Africa, the long-term embodied effects of trauma from apartheid are no longer relevant. In either case, there are a set of complex and contradictory implications of this work. Now here I show results from a separate analysis on a similar topic, which was to evaluate the long-term impacts of prenatal stress and trauma from apartheid on psychiatric disease risk in children 18 years after in utero exposure. So this is coming from the same birth cohort study with which I'm working with. These results show no evidence for intergenerational trauma and psychiatric risk in the subsequent generation 18 years later, but we did identify significant effects only after considering for the compounding effect of stress and trauma experienced by the child. Thus, these data suggest that the developmental and health consequences of trauma exposures among pregnant women can durably extend across the life course of the future child and may even impact the subsequent generation. Now, in conclusion, I provide these reflections as a preliminary attempt to make sense of the complex politics of studying intergenerational trauma from apartheid in the South African context. I raised the various stakes of conducting this research in a context with ongoing discussions of transitional justice, scientific racism, and systematic shortages in the public mental health sector. I also have described 3 points of tensions that have emerged in my personal experience and ethnographic observation of running my study. While my investigation is ongoing, the need for historically mindful and socially just scientific practice is needed. Active work to undo scientific racism and move towards new anti-racist science that also has scientific benefits is a focus of my ongoing and future work. These tangible practices include stronger participant and local engagement, developing accountability structures for research practice and dissemination, and the co-production of scientific knowledge and research that sets the narrative based on lived experience and priorities of those affected by these issues. And these are all opportunities that I hope to explore in my future research. Thank you very much.